You're standing in your garden at sunrise, coffee in hand, and there they are again, holes chewed through your cabbage leaves, aphids clustered thick on the underside of your tomato plants, squash bugs marching across the zucchini like they own the place, and you've already sprayed 3 times this month. What if I told you 2 of the cheapest metals on Earth, metals you can hold in the palm of your hand for under $20, will end every insect problem you have permanently? No spraying, no reapplying, no rotating chemicals, because the bugs built up immunity again. The Amish families I spent time with in Lancaster County have been using this exact method since the 1860s, and it's the reason their gardens look like paintings, while the rest of us are losing half our harvest to pests we can't even identify. And stay with me until the end, because there's a document I found buried in the Penn State Agricultural Archives from 1923, a field report from a farm outside Intercourse, Pennsylvania, that explains why this technique disappeared from every gardening book printed after World War II. It's not what you think. And once you see it, you'll understand why your grandparents never had the bug problems you have now. Let me start with the part that shocked me the most. When Eli, an Amish grandfather in his 70s, first showed it to me. He walked me out to his potato patch. Now, if you've ever grown potatoes, you know the Colorado potato beetle. Those striped little monsters that can strip a plant to bare stems in 48 hours. Eli's potatoes were flawless. Not a single beetle, not a single chewed leaf. And I watched him. He never sprayed anything, not neem oil, not diatomaceous earth, not a thing. What he did do was push thin strips of copper into the soil around the base of each plant. Just narrow bands of copper, maybe 2 inches wide, buried about 1 inch deep, so only the top edge showed. That was it. The whole secret, he said, was that most crawling insects refuse to cross copper. Their bodies carry a slight electrical charge, and when they touch copper-soil interfaces, it creates a tiny galvanic reaction that feels, to them, like a mild electric shock. Slugs get it worst. The reaction with their slime is almost instant, but beetles, cutworms, earwigs, pill bugs, ants farming aphids, they all avoid it. Cornell University confirmed this in a 1994 study on copper barriers for slug control. 96% reduction, not 40, not 60, 96%. And the copper doesn't wear out, it doesn't wash away, it doesn't need reapplication. Eli told me the strips around his potatoes had been in that exact ground for 19 years. 19 years of pest control for the cost of a single pack of copper strips. But copper alone is only half of what makes this system work, because copper handles the crawlers. It does nothing for what flies in from above, and that's where the second metal comes in, and this is where it gets strange. The Amish have been using zinc alongside copper for over 150 years, and until I saw it with my own eyes in Holmes County, Ohio, I didn't believe it either. Zinc, specifically in the form of galvanized nails or thin zinc strips tacked onto wooden garden stakes, creates what the old German-speaking farmers called a Spannungsfeld, a tension field. When zinc and copper are both present in moist soil, they form a weak bioelectric circuit. The soil itself becomes the electrolyte. You're essentially building a giant, low-voltage battery underneath your garden. And the current, while far too weak for you to feel, is strong enough to repel soft-bodied insects and disrupt the egg-laying behavior of flying pests like cabbage moths and squash vine borers. Auburn University did a soil conductivity study in 2008 that measured this exact phenomenon. They found that beds with dual metal placement had 37% higher microbial activity and dramatically lower pest pressure than control beds. The researchers couldn't explain all of it, They admitted in the conclusion that something was happening in the root zone that traditional entomology didn't fully account for. The Amish don't need the explanation. They've known it works since their great-grandfathers brought the technique over from Switzerland and the Palatinate region of Germany in the 1700s. It was standard practice on every plain farm in Pennsylvania until roughly 1948, and then it vanished from the books. Which brings me to the part I don't think you're going to like. Now, if you already own a home with a garden, you've been working for 20 or 30 years, and you're thinking, this sounds like something only new homesteaders can set up, stay with me, because this next part is specifically for you. You don't tear up your existing beds. You don't start over. Here's exactly what ELI told me to tell the people in my county who already had established gardens. You take a roll of copper, flashing, from any hardware store, the kind roofers use, about 6 inches wide, costs around $18 for a 10-foot roll. You cut it into strips 2 inches wide and 8 inches long. You push those strips vertically into the soil around the perimeter of each bed, spaced about 12 inches apart, with just a ½ inch showing above the surface. You can do an entire raised bed in under 10 minutes. Then you take a box of galvanized roofing nails, $3 at any farm store, and you hammer them into your existing wooden stakes, tomato cages, or trellis posts. 4 or 5 nails per stake, driven deep so the heads sit flush with the wood. That's it. You haven't dug anything up. You haven't disturbed root systems. You haven't rebuilt anything. You've retrofitted your existing garden this weekend for under $25 total. And here's what you'll notice. The first week, not much. The second week, you'll see slug damage drop to almost nothing. By week 4, the aphid populations collapse because the ants that farm them stop crossing the copper. By week 6, the cabbage moths that were laying eggs on your brassicas start going to your neighbor's garden instead, and by the end of the first full season, you will genuinely wonder how you ever gardened without it. I had a neighbor in Ohio, a woman in her 60s who had been fighting squash bugs for 15 years. Try this in her existing garden. She called me 3 months later, and I could hear her laughing on the phone. She said, I have 0 squash bugs, 0, after 15 years. She told me she felt cheated. Cheated by every magazine, every extension service pamphlet, every big box garden center that had sold her pesticides for a decade and a half, when the answer was sitting in the plumbing aisle the whole time. Which brings us back to that 1923 document. In the Penn State Agricultural Archives, there's a collection of field reports from county extension agents who surveyed Amish and Mennonite farms in the 1920s, trying to document what these communities were doing that kept their yields so consistently high without commercial inputs. One report, written by an agent named H.R. Shoemaker, describes a farm near Intercourse, Pennsylvania, where the farmer, identified only as Brother Yoder, had used copper and zinc in his vegetable plots for 4 decades. The report notes, and I'm paraphrasing from my notes, that the farm had no measurable pest damage on cabbage, potatoes, or cucurbits. The agent recommended further study. That further study never happened. What happened instead was the chemical revolution of the 1940s DDT hit the market in 1945. Organophosphate pesticides followed. The USDA shifted its extension education entirely toward chemical pest control because that's where the research money was coming from. Copper and zinc barrier techniques, which had been published in American farming manuals as late as 1938, simply stopped being mentioned, not outlawed, not banned, just quietly dropped from every new publication, every new textbook, every new extension pamphlet. By 1960, an entire generation of American gardeners had never heard of it. The Amish kept doing what they had always done. They don't read mainstream gardening magazines. They don't attend extension workshops. They pass techniques down from father to son, from grandmother to granddaughter, in the exact same form they were taught. And while the rest of American agriculture spent 70 years chasing pesticide after pesticide, watching each one lose effectiveness as insects evolved resistance, the Amish were getting clean harvests with 2 metals and a hammer. Now here's where most people stop listening and try what I just described. And look, if you do only that, you'll already see a dramatic change in your garden. But there's a deeper layer that almost nobody outside of plain communities knows about, and it's what I want to share with you now because this is the part that genuinely stunned me. Copper and zinc don't just repel insects. They feed the soil. Both metals are essential micronutrients for plant health. Copper is critical for photosynthesis and lignin production. That's the stuff that makes plant cell walls strong enough to resist insect chewing in the first place. Zinc is essential for enzyme function and for the production of auxin, the hormone that controls root growth. When you place these metals in wet soil, they slowly, very slowly, release trace amounts of ionic copper and zinc into the root zone. We're talking micrograms. Nothing toxic, nothing that would ever build up to dangerous levels. But over the course of a growing season, your plants pull in exactly the trace minerals they need to build tougher cell walls and stronger root systems. And here's the magic of it. A plant with high lignin content and a vigorous root system is chemically unattractive to most insects. Bugs can sense weak plants. That's why pests always swarm the sickliest tomato in your row. Strong plants emit different volatile organic compounds, and most pest species simply fly past them. So the metals do 2 things at once. They create a physical and electrical barrier that keeps bugs out, and they slowly fortify the plants themselves so that any bug that does make it through the barrier finds a plant it doesn't want to eat. Amos, a blacksmith in Holmes County, explained it to me like this. He said, "The English think pest control is about killing. We think it's about making the plant strong enough that the bug has no interest. The metals do both. That's why they last." Now, the modern research backs every word of this. A 2016 study from Ohio State, specifically looking at low-input farming systems, measured micronutrient uptake in gardens using embedded copper and zinc versus chemically fertilized control gardens. The metal gardens had 22% higher lignin content in leafy greens and 41% fewer pest incidents over the season. The researchers noted that the effect compounded year after year, meaning the longer you leave the metals in place, the better the results get. Compare that to pesticides, which get less effective every year as resistance builds. You are on a treadmill that runs slightly uphill every season. The Amish are on a system that runs slightly downhill every season. I want to tell you one more thing before we get to the technique I mentioned at the beginning, the one I promised you from the archives, because there's a specific combination of placement that Eli showed me that nobody I've seen online is teaching correctly. Most people, if they've heard of copper at all, put it flat on top of the soil or wrap it around the base of a tree trunk. That's useless. The copper has to be in contact with moist soil at a depth of at least 1 inch, with only a small strip visible above the surface. That's because the galvanic reaction that creates the repellent effect requires continuous contact with soil moisture. A dry copper strip sitting on mulch does nothing. And the zinc has to be above ground level, tacked into wood or fencing, at least 6 inches above the soil, but no more than 3 feet. The ideal height, according to the old Pennsylvania Dutch practice, is the height of your knee. That's the zone where flying insects make their final landing approach, and the electromagnetic disturbance is strongest at that elevation. Now here's the technique from the archive, the one I've never seen in a single modern book. In that 1923 Shoemaker report, there's a single paragraph that describes something Brother Yoder did that went beyond simple copper strips and zinc nails. He kept, at each of the four corners of his main vegetable plot, a small clay pot buried in the ground with the rim flush to the soil surface. Inside each clay pot, he placed a single copper penny. This was pre-1982, so real copper, and a single galvanized roofing nail. The pot was filled to the top with rainwater collected from his barn roof, and it was refilled whenever it evaporated. Shoemaker noted, almost in passing, that Yoder claimed this four-corner setup was, quote, the heart of the garden, end quote, and that without it, the copper strips alone were only half as effective. I tried to dismiss this when I first read it. It sounded like folklore, a superstition from an old farmer, but I tried it anyway. In Ohio, at a small test plot behind the house I was staying in, 4 clay pots, 4 pennies from 1978, 4 galvanized nails, rainwater only, and the results that first season were measurably better than the plot I'd set up with only copper strips and zinc nails. I didn't understand why until I talked to a retired agricultural chemist from Penn State, a man in his 80s who still remembered the old copper-zinc literature from before the chemical era. He explained that the four-corner water pots create what's called a distributed ionic field. The rainwater, being slightly acidic, slowly dissolves trace amounts of copper and zinc ions, and capillary action pulls those ions outward through the surrounding soil in a roughly circular pattern. With 4 pots at 4 corners, those circles overlap and create a consistent micronutrient gradient across the entire garden bed. Plants within that gradient, he told me, show measurable increases in systemic acquired resistance, the plant's own immune response to pests and disease. It's the same mechanism that makes plants resistant to disease after a mild infection, but triggered instead by micronutrient sufficiency. This is not in any gardening book I have ever read. It is not on any homesteading website I have ever visited. It exists in exactly one place, a typewritten field report in a Pennsylvania archive that almost nobody has looked at in 100 years, and in the oral tradition of a few dozen Amish families who still practice it without knowing why it works. You can set this up in your own garden this weekend. 4 small clay pots, the 4-inch terracotta kind you can buy for $1 each. 4 pennies minted before 1982, because after that year, pennies are mostly zinc with only a copper coating, 4 galvanized roofing nails, rainwater. That's it. Total cost, maybe $5. Total setup time, 20 minutes. Durability, as long as the pots don't crack, essentially permanent. Combined with copper strips around your beds and galvanized nails on your stakes, you have a complete, integrated, self-reinforcing pest control system that costs less than a single bottle of organic insecticide and lasts for decades. The Amish didn't invent modern organic gardening. They just never stopped doing the thing that worked, while the rest of the country chased chemicals down a dead-end road for 70 years. Here's what nobody told you. The reason your garden struggles isn't because you're doing something wrong. It's because the knowledge that would make it easy was quietly set aside 3 generations ago, and the people who kept it alive don't advertise. If you're the kind of person who senses that something important has been missing from the advice we've all been given, that real, working, time-tested knowledge has been pushed to the margins so someone else could sell you a bottle every spring, then you already know what to do with what you just heard. You try it, you see for yourself, you become the neighbor who hands a copper strip to the next person complaining about slugs. I want to ask you one thing before you go. In the comments, tell me this. What's the one pest that's driven you the most crazy over the last